member who tends to deny that the climate crisis has an effect on the number and strength of California's recent wildfires. What is your response to the notion that recent destructive wildfires are simply the result of mismanagement on behalf of forest services and not at all affected by climate change? Yes, it's a really good question. And there's actually another question, and I'll address it now. People have asked, do you need to remember these questions that students are putting forth? Because they'll be in the basic lectures too. Those questions will be what students have put in the Canvas regular Q&A. And the answer is no. If students introduce a fact or two there, you're not responsible for that. But here's the tricky part. You are responsible for my reply and what I have to say, because that's basically the lecture. And especially with what shows up on here, because the way this course is structured, as I mentioned before, but I'll reiterate, it's kind of like a smaller classroom where people have things to say, they ask questions, what's important to them, and then I respond to it. And that's, I think, a really effective way of teaching because it allows you to have a role in directing where we're going. And that can be really helpful to me. And I give you a big example. I used to teach courses like this where the whole focus was trying to convince people that the climate crisis is real, it's severe, and it's a problem. And that was useful at a time, but then I started getting the memo from the questions. People didn't need that anymore. You don't need that anymore. Arguably, no one in the room needs to know that the climate crisis is real. Instead, we have to address the fact that you're anxious about it, climate anxiety, maybe getting to the point of almost being, metaphorically petrified in the sense of not doing anything. So yeah, I could have made everything entirely programmatic and I could have set all the questions, but instead I want to hear from you. So in this question, people say, and this became a big deal right after the Paradise Fire, the Camp Fire in Paradise, California, which you watch documentaries on. The then president of the United States, which was Donald Trump, came there and said, this was your fault. This is not climate crisis. You mismanaged your forest. You should have been cleaning out underbrush. And if you had done that, we wouldn't have had the problem. And then Trump, realizing that that stuck with the number of people who would vote for him, then tried to build policy around it. Specifically, later he said, yeah, California's having all these wildfires, which we know were caused by, or at least aggravated by the climate crisis. But Trump said, they're caused by mismanagement of your forests. The federal government is no longer going to be sending aid to California when these happen. So remember, the Camp Fire in Paradise was the most expensive natural disaster that year on the planet. Wildfires are very expensive, and this was a way of trying to get the federal government not to have to pay for it. So what's the truth of it? Well, this is why it's a good question, because generally there are easy answers to it and then not so easy. The easy answer is this. I mentioned it before. California's climate used to be such that we had a lot of rains over the winter. They would stop around April or so, which they still do, and then we had nothing for months and months, all through the summer into the fall. As we had no rain, everything dried out, became literal like timber box. And then, fortunately, in September and October, the rains came. They almost always did. This was a traditional climate of California. If that had happened the years that the Paradise Fire happened, as well as the Thomas Fire, the one I keep referencing in Santa Barbara, there would have been no problem. Why? Because the Paradise Fire happened in November. The Thomas Fire happened in December. If we had normal seasonal rains, everything would have gotten wetted down. It would have no longer been nearly as easy to ignite. And you can imagine, we just had a rain. Try to go out there and don't try to go start a forest fire. But if you tried to go out and tried to start a fire somewhere out there, everything's just too wet for it. And that's why we didn't have problems. Most of the major wildfires that we had recently have all been in those later months because as it stayed dry for months longer, it just got drier and drier and drier, and any little spark ignited it and got it going. So the answer to it, in particular in the case of Paradise and the Thomas Fire, this would not have happened without climate change, because what the new climate, what the governor of California back then, Jerry Brown, called the new normal, is now that we have later rains. That being said, If you want a real answer to this, a more thorough one, you can find it online at a reliable website like Skeptical Science. So Skeptical Science is actually of people who are a little skeptical of science. If you want to know what the truth is about something like wildfires, go there and it'll be a very long article. And this is compiled and at least curated by scientists, and it's very reliable information. And if you go to Skeptical Science, you will find that, yeah, underbrush is actually an issue, but a smaller issue and not the major issue there. There are other factors regarding what I just said, and you can have a much longer answer. But unfortunately, as we're going to see today, because we're going to deal with climate change denial, the answers to things like this that are short and simple and are kind of common sense are the ones that stick. Oh, well, you should have been cleaning the underbrush. It's easy. It's one sentence. People get it. And if you hear someone in authority, like the President of the United States saying it, you believe it. The truth of the matter is often, more complicated than that, as we'll see. And we're going to, as you know, we're getting into denial today. Next question. Is it too late to reverse the harm that's already been done to the climate? What steps should we take in California to better prepare for droughts and wildfires? Yeah, it's a really good question. And the depressing part of it, and this is our first 3 weeks of depressing material, it will take hundreds of years for the climate to ultimately go back to where it was if it does. That's the situation. Some things you can take steps for. So you can imagine with like sea level rise, places are already building seawalls. You saw before the flood how Florida, Miami in particular, is now raising up storm drains and infrastructure and all. You can do things like that. Wildfires and drought, it's much more difficult. So one thing, you can do things like try to preserve the water that you have, and one way of doing that would be getting rid of, the agricultural part of the agricultural sector in California that's devoted heavily to raising animals and livestock, which is 46% of the water usage in this state. Something like that you can do, but it's very difficult. And you can prepare for droughts a little by clearing underbrush and all, but unfortunately, this is very difficult. And the really difficult part of this equation, all these things cost money. It costs money to build storm walls. It costs money to change agricultural practices and all. And it is getting to the point, and people are afraid of the fact that the money that we spend either after a tragedy like in Paradise, California, or preparing for it with like storm walls and all, that will be greater than the core cost that we should be paying now, which is to do things like build more wind, build more solar, change things. That's where the money should be going. Then you wouldn't have climate change to the extent that it is. But now that it's happening so quickly, we have to put money into emergency preparedness and also into actually paying for things that happen. Let me get another one here. So this one was actually put in the course Q&A, but I moved it over. Would not eating beef from the campus dining commons have any effect? It seems like the dining commons produce food on a mass basis and leftovers are simply disposed of at the end of the day. So would switching to the vegetarian vegan option do anything, especially since it would be just an individual effort? Yeah, this gets to like one of the core things we've been talking about. The answer is you not eating beef, you one person is not going to make any difference. You're right, the food's probably prepared in advance, it's getting thrown away. I hinted already at the fact, which we're going to deal with in 1 week, about how food waste is even worse than eating animal products as far as global greenhouse gas emissions. So what's the answer then? Well, mass action is good. So someone else actually wrote to me, emailed me directly saying, well, couldn't we make an effort to get beef off of this campus, period? And that's a great idea. But I think the way to go about that, if you want to like start from the ground up, it's better to join with an organization on campus, something like, environmental protection, or something like CalPERG, or even to do it. But even the bigger question is, because most people, and I think this is something regarding this, and we'll talk about it when we get to food options, which is soon, not this week. You're not going to convince this whole country to go vegetarian or vegan. I mean, vegetarian vegans in the US across all, age groups and all, far less than 10%. So I think that's unlikely that you will do it. So then that makes the question, how do you actually address this? And that's where you need even bigger change. You need things like national laws regarding pricing carbon or so. And what I mean by that, and we'll get to it, if you raise the cost of emissions, so if people have to pay for emissions, people are creating them, whether it's oil companies or people raising cattle, that will raise the cost of the end product. So burger cost will go up. If you do that and you raise it and raise it and raise it, so suddenly you can't, buy a burger at McDonald's, I don't know what it is, $5, or say it's now $20, that will gradually reduce it, especially if you then bring in other options. Like if you stop serving beef at the Commons, dining Commons, and you brought in things like, turkey burgers even, let alone veggie burgers, that would work. Yeah, okay, so that's it. Let me see if we have any questions from today yet. And the answer is not yet. So let's go over to this. This lecture this week is about climate change denial. And this is our third and last, I would call it depressing week, in the sense that the first week we dealt with the global problem. Second week, we dealt with the local, in the sense of California problem of how we're being impacted by the climate change. And this week, we're going to take up the fact, which is also, I think, enormously depressing, that even if everyone got together, this would be a difficult thing to do to solve the climate crisis. Let me be very clear. It's absolutely possible. It's not like we're missing key technology or something. We have alternatives. We have alternatives to burning oil and all for electricity. We have renewables, solar, wind, and others. We have alternatives to everything. We now know, for example, you don't need to eat beef to be healthy, which 100 years ago wasn't quite known, but now we have a much better science of nutrition. We know that the flip side is actually true, that if you get beef out of your diet, you're going to have a healthier diet. If you eat a largely plant-based diet, it's actually healthier and better. So everything is in place, but why aren't we doing it? Part of it is it's hard to move the needle when it comes to cultural change. But what we're going to talk about this week is there are powerful factions that are trying to stop us from addressing the climate crisis. These are things like the fossil fuel companies and their affiliates. They are spending not like millions, but hundreds of millions, probably billions of dollars every year trying to stop any action on the climate crisis. And why? Well, so I'll give you an example. I just mentioned like pricing carbon, a way that would make every product that we buy that is responsible for GHG emissions more expensive. Well, we knew this for decades. And in fact, Denmark started pricing carbon back in 1992, over 30 years ago. But the fossil fuel companies take the position, because of that, every year they can keep us from action is another year that they will continue to profit. And when you see the like Merchants of Doubt or Climate of Doubt, if you haven't watched them already, it's very similar to the tobacco industry, who knew they were producing an addictive poison and selling it directly to the public, and in some cases to children, and yet they continued doing it for decade after decade to continue their profits. That's what's going on. And in terms of climate change denial, it's remarkably effective. And, if you don't believe me, look at where we are. Whenever we try to get some kind of legislation through Congress, we're kind of blocked because it's been so effective. So education, as I note here, is absolutely central. And of course, you'd expect me to say that as an educator, but the climate change deniers have really focused on that. So we're going to see how they did that today. But first, here goes our first iClicker poll. I don't know if I asked this question before, but let's just hit it. Okay. How worried are you? How anxious are you by the climate crisis? I might have asked this before. Do you think about it daily, very often, moderately, or do you take position you're not too worried? And I think this is a position some people may feel, as you're confident that it's going to get worked out and it's going to be resolved, or full stop, not at all worried about it. So I'm curious. Should do this drum roll, please. The results are Most people in the second category, but if you look at A and B together, extremely and very worried are both pretty significant, and we're looking at 500 people. So I think that's pretty big. So you still have time to vote if you want. Okay, so let's go to our next actual slide. So the National Center for Science and Education, they made a report and revealed that 30% of K through 12 teachers are teaching that climate change is a two-sided argument, and that, quote, many scientists see natural causes behind recent global warming. Conversely, more than half of K through 12 teachers do not teach climate change at all, and those who do teach it only devote an hour or two to the issue per year. So how did this happen? That when, we know the climate crisis is real, and we're going to actually, in the comments already, you might think, well, this is like maybe another part of the United States. This is not California where people believe that. But people in this class and the previous classes have noted that they had teachers who full stop said that the climate crisis is not real, that it's all fabricated. And we now know that almost a third of K through 12 teachers are teaching that. That's a huge issue. And today we're going to delve into why they would be doing that. And conversely, that if they're not saying it's not true, they're sort of in a de facto way saying it's not very important because they're not going to spend much time on it. So let's talk about that. Part of the problem, and this is where polls come in they're so interesting and come in so important, because we now know, first off, and from the reading that we did this week, if you started it, and you probably knew this fact anyhow, it's the most referenced of all documents on the climate change. In fact, it was created by originally Nomi Oreskes, who's a professor at Harvard, who visited English 24 last year, and I think will come again this year. So that's a fact. 97% of all climate scientists agree that human caused climate change is real and happening. But when questioned about this, only 30% of middle school and 45% of high school teachers selected the correct answer. And I note here from a broad range, from it was in a poll, how many scientists agree with this? Somewhere between 81 and 100%. I mean, the answer is 97, but that's a broad range. And even then you have those numbers when it's clearly, you should know that. So then it raises this question, which we're addressing today. Why are so many teachers confused about the climate crisis? And this is a pivotal question, right? Because why would so many students then become confused by it? So the answer is there's a lot of climate change denial literature out there. It's a lot of media out there. You can whatever your preferred media, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, what used to be called Twitter, you'll find it everywhere. But teachers have been specifically targeted by the fossil fuel industry and its affiliates like the Heartland Institute. And I'll talk about who they are in a minute. But so the reading that you have this week, which is why scientists disagree about global warming, and let me just as an aside say, that's a lie. Scientists don't disagree about global warming right off the bat. There's no explaining it because it's not true. But the Heartland Institute emailed 300,000 free copies of this book to K through 12 teachers across the United States back in 2017. And they've subsequently, I'll talk about how else they've distributed it, but they've made it free now as a PDF online, which is why you folks were able to access it. So it's a sad fact that the fossil fuel industry knows how important teaching is and that they're acting kind of unabashedly on it. And so the Heartland Institute notes, talking about this book, it, quote, explains why the claim of scientific consensus, in other words, that 97% figure on the causes and consequences of the climate change, is without merit. The authors comprehensively and specifically rebuke the surveys and studies used to support claims of a consensus. They then provide a detailed survey of the physical science of global warming. So this book is setting out to say that scientists do not agree that climate change is in fact not happening or not happening as severely as we thought. That's the goal. But let me just, and I'll explain this in more detail, but just set that aside for a minute. The goal here is not, and whether it's teachers, whether it's students that they teach, or whether it's the general public, the climate change denial groups are generally not hoping to convince everyone that the climate crisis isn't real. That would be a big hope. I mean, and scientists, reputable scientists on their side, that's exactly what they're trying to do, the converse, convince everyone that the climate crisis is real. But the reason that both of the film options that you have this week have doubt in them is because their goal, the denial goal, is to raise doubt in your mind, not to slam dunk, get you convinced that it's not happening, but maybe not be so sure. Like this book is like, well, maybe we don't know enough. Maybe we should just get more information. Scientists should do more studies. We should figure it out. But let's not get, spending hundreds of billions of dollars or more trying to solve a problem that might not exist. That's all they care about. And you can see what their goal is to continue to extract as much, fossil fuels as possible and to make as much profit from it. They don't care if you believe that it's causing, that climate crisis isn't real. They just want you to doubt that it's real so that you don't support actions intended to stop it. And that's the big goal here. So the obvious thing, it's sent to K through 12 teachers, but the real goal is clearly children. And the goal is to teach them that same skepticism, that doubt, and give them that information from the people that presumably they might trust the most, which is their teachers, and especially science teachers. So maybe they hear it from their neighbor and they say, I don't know if my neighbor knows what he's talking about, but my teacher certainly knows what they're talking about. And they say that, they're skeptical. And then the number game here is assuming that each of these teachers then receives the book and teaches around 30 students. This approach could potentially, since it was sent to 300,000 teachers, reach 10 million children. And of course, that's just in 1 year. So you're talking about reaching potentially tens and tens of millions of children once you sort of radicalize a teacher into believing or to being skeptical regarding the issue. It's a fascinating strategy, a well thought out strategy by the climate change denial group. When you read it, one of the reasons it's so effective, if you haven't, is it doesn't sound like the rant of a fringe radical group, but is built on, relatively speaking, or at least what gives the impression of being, if you're not a critical reader, carefully constructed arguments. So don't be surprised if you become a little skeptical, because that's what it was meant to do, and it was written carefully. So actually I have a slide coming up on this, but I'll tell you now because it's interesting. The first year I taught this particular course, 2020, I didn't have a little header. It was the material was up on YouTube and not in Canvas for you to make your response in YouTube. And I didn't have any header there. It was just a little video. It was like 5 minutes long. You were supposed to watch it. And I explained kind of everything I just did here, that be careful with this because this is created by the fossil fuel industry. It's meant to confuse you. Some people, being people, decided not to watch my little video first and instead just made the comment after doing the reading. And these people didn't know what this was about. And I wasn't trying to conduct a study, but it kind of became one. And these people said, I can't believe this. I was under the impression that climate change is real, but the professor has assigned this and it's clearly not a closed case anymore. I'm becoming more and more skeptical. And these are smart, intelligent UCSB students. I mean, this is not, random group of people in the US. And this literature worked on them. Not all of them, but some. So, and I'll talk about why we kind of need to be sympathetic to people who've been influenced by this in a minute. But don't think that climate change, when I first started teaching this material, I didn't think that this stuff was very serious. I thought that this was just ranting and all, but I've come to realize it's very carefully constructed. People are spending millions and millions of dollars to build these arguments. Even if teachers are correctly informed and want to teach about the climate crisis, in a number of states, and I mentioned 3 of them here, Maine, South Dakota, and Virginia, bills have been introduced that would hamper their efforts. So the Virginia bill argues that this is necessary because, quote, Many teachers in public elementary and secondary school classrooms are abusing taxpayer resources and abusing their ability to speak to captive audiences of students in an attempt to indoctrinate or influence students under the guise of teaching for social justice and other sectarian doctrines. So you might expect to read that in a blog somewhere, but this was a bill actually introduced in Virginia calling teaching social justice as a sectarian doctrine and bringing climate change into that. So it's frustrating because this is another part of the multi-pronged approach that the fossil fuel industry has. One, just try to randomly get teachers on your side or get them to be at least, confused or in doubt. And then this is another effort. Well, that's not going to work for everyone. Let's see if we can't just say what's going to happen and what teachers can and can't teach. If it sounds familiar, and I just mentioned here because there are similar attempts to ban the teaching of something like critical race theory in the US, which draws attention to another truth, not the climate crisis truth, but the fact that racism is systemic in the US and has been, before our country was even founded. In many ways, these efforts to ban the teaching of critical race theory were influenced by the former president, Donald Trump, who called critical race theory, quote, propaganda, left-wing indoctrination, and that, quote, the teaching of this horrible doctrine to our children is a form of child abuse in the truest sense of those words. So there's an enormous battle going on right now. It's actually in the headlines, trying to influence what can be taught at school. These are just two of the issues here. I bring up critical race theory, I bring up, climate crisis. We could be talking about trans rights. We could talk about all sorts of things that are being, or sort of the battleground for what happens in classrooms. Some states are attempting to go even further than this by mandating the students be taught that the scientific consensus on climate change is simply wrong. And this is extraordinary. So it's not saying like the science isn't quite clear or something. It's saying flat out it's wrong. So I'll give you an example of that. This is from Montana, a bill introduced in 2019, which says that, quote, when providing educational and informational material on climate change, the following findings should be observed, quote, reasonable amounts of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere have no verifiable impacts on the environment. Science shows that human emissions do not change the atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions enough to cause climate change. Claims that carbon associated with human activities cause climate change are flat out invalid, and nature, not human activity, causes climate change. So full stop. It's not anthropogenic. It's cool. This is the idea that this has to be taught. And that's a really extraordinary statement. So you may know in some states, so an issue like creationism can't necessarily be taught as the only doctrine, but in some states in the United States, that if you teach evolution, Darwin and the evolution that science all agrees with, you have to teach creationism side by side and let students decide. This goes stronger because it's saying flat out, the climate crisis is not real and the scientific consensus is not there. And that it is not caused by human activity, but is in fact natural causes. Just extraordinary. So Americans, people in the US, are clearly being influenced by this massive campaign of disinformation, and it's supported by a range of groups that are what are known as conservative think tanks, and usually referred to CTTs, which I call them that. And a few examples would be the Cato Institute, Heartland Institute, Competitive Edge Institute, and which are funded pretty much directly when we know where the funding comes from by fossil fuel companies or affiliates, like the Koch family. Used to be the Koch brothers, but now it's the Koch family, and similar interests. So if you wonder how it's happening, these organizations are at the front line of doing it, and they, for example, published this book. These groups, conservative think tanks, they date back from the Reagan administration, in some cases even earlier, and they've long seen themselves, to quote the Cato Institute, as defenders of America's heritage of individual liberty, free markets, and constitutionally limited government. So one of the things that might seem like, why is it in there? Free markets is central to this. Naomi Oreskes, who was the one who did that study to find out about 97% of scientists who believe climate change is real. She's written a great book recently called The Big Myth, and she talks about how Americans have been sort of trained by industry over the decades to believe that free markets, in the sense of the government that we have now, with very little government intervention, that's been going on for a long time, and these groups have been at the forefront of convincing us that way. So, the Heartland Institute, which is the group that actually published what we're reading, has fought bitterly against issues like tobacco legislation. And this was in like the 1980s and 90s. And at the time, that was one of their primary goals. So they weren't focusing on the climate crisis then because there wasn't that much activity trying to limit it. But tobacco industry was under assault. And this group came to the defense of the tobacco industry, not because they were nice, but the tobacco industry paid them to do it, just like the tobacco industry is now paying them to fight the climate crisis. With respect to climate change, there was a 2013 study by two scholars who looked at 100 English language books denying anthropogenic climate change, dating from the very first ones that appeared, which are in the early 1980s through 2010. And they found verifiable links to CTT groups for 87% of those emerging from publishing houses. So what that means simply is during that period, if you picked up a book denying the climate crisis, almost 9 out of 10 of them were verifiably connected to these groups who were funding them, who paid to have those books made. The problem is it's harder because once this study came out, those groups, conservative think tanks, they stopped making it clear what they were funding or not, and they used like shell organizations like Donors Trust, which you'll see in both of the documentaries, to conceal it. So now these books are mostly self-published, but we don't know how the people got the money to publish them. Presumably, it was still coming from CTTs. And it was even higher once. So if you go back to the 80s and 90s, it was like 100% and 95%. So where does climate change denial literature come from? It's coming principally from these groups who are being funded, for the most part, directly by the fossil fuel industry, as far as we know. So what's the bottom line? If you pick up a book denying that, human-caused climate change, it's real, it's exceptionally likely that it was published or financed by a conservative think tank funded by the fossil fuel industry or one of its many affiliates. So if you wonder, like, who's behind all this, this is the paper trail, as it were. And of course, I'm talking about books. That's just the tip of the iceberg. That's not where most people get their information nowadays, I would argue. And these conservative think tanks have focused a range of websites, blogs, other online activities, as well as more traditional advertising. I note one of my favorite billboards that they made, and this was from the Heartland Institute. So you may know this person, the Unabomber, who was this radical activist who was active, I guess the 1990s, sending bombs to people and blowing up. And it has a picture of the Unabomber, and it says, I believe in global warming. Do you? And the clear implication is the only people who believe this are fringe, violent environmentalists, like the most fringe and violent one they can imagine can think of, which is the Unabomber. My favorite commercial that they did was another group, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, argued that greenhouse gas is not, in fact, contributing to the climate change. So that takes off the hook any fossil fuel company, because that's the problem. They produce CO2, whether you're burning coal, so-called natural gas, methane, or oil. And the commercial ends with, CO2 is essential to life. We breathe it in, we breathe it out, plants breathe it in. They call it pollution. We call it life. They do that with a straight face, and it's remarkable. If you go onto YouTube and if you just search for that, you can find it. It's not a very good quality one, but there you go. They also directly attack science and scientists in response to, the definitive report on climate change, this massive thing, many thousands. So every country on the planet is invited to be part of the IPCC, to send scientists, the working group, the leaders of it switch around the planet, thousands and thousands of scientists. It's the definitive document. And every few years they put out a new one to let us know where we are. That's the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the Heartland Institute, to counter this, produced its own group called the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, the NIPCC, with the goal of, confusing everyone. If you look at it, and I actually have it in my office, it's like 3 massive books, and it's the same size as the IPCC report. And the goal, and this kind of makes it as clear as anywhere, it's like this tit for tat thing. Whatever the real scientists say, they have their group of folks come with the opposite thing, saying the opposite. And again, it's to just confuse people, to raise doubt. Yeah, so the book that we're reading from, it was also, and this is interesting, initially not sent to teachers, but they did a smaller publishing of 50,000 copies, and they sent it and gave it away, in some cases sold, but mainly gave it away, to elected officials, civic and business leaders, scientists, and other opinion leaders. So that's actually from their website. And if you think about it, you can see that these 2 prongs kind of have to work together. So you can do what they did here, and you can see it's their priority. Focus on the policymakers, focus on politicians, get them to believe it. If necessary, make donations to their reelection campaigns, get them on your side. The problem with that is, this is a democracy. That wouldn't work, because something like the climate crisis is not in anyone's interest for the most part, unless you're a fossil fuel company. Americans wouldn't go along with it. They wouldn't vote people like that in. If they found they had, they would quickly vote them out. That's how it would work. But that's where the other prong comes in. You have to convince a large segment of the American public to vote for the officials that have gotten this information, and in many cases are being paid to vote favorably toward the fossil fuel industry. So that's the project, convincing the American public. All sorts of things online are attempting to do it, but then really you need to get in early and try to convince people at a very young age that it's there. And if you have those 2 things, if you have a strong, group of voters voting in the people that are committed to doing the bidding of these industries, you're pretty much where we are right now in the US. And again, this is the one we're reading now, which is, to be clear, the 2nd edition. And now it's posted online, as you know, as it's a free PDF. So it's designed to make a range of individuals question whether it's real or not, doubt. So first off, policymakers, politicians, business leaders, all that, educators, and by extension, millions of children. And by making it available free online, it's really there for everyone. I mean, that's the goal here, to spread doubt across these different communities and in different ways. And we're going to see more of it today. So next iClicker poll. This is an interesting one, I think. Oops. How much did you learn about the climate crisis in high school? A great deal? Quite a bit? Some, very little, or nothing. So I'm not asking if you learned incorrect information. I'm just trying to get a feel for how much information is being disseminated, or how much focus is being given to this issue. So the result is some, seems to definitely be leading the way. So a great deal is really in the minority. So it's kind of a perfect curve there. A great deal and nothing are equal, so that's not very common for them. And also quite a bit and very little is there. So it almost averages into that middle, which is not much. Okay, you can continue answering that if you want, but I think that's very revealing that in 2023, a number of you are freshmen or sophomores, that's where we are in California right now with education. I think that says it as clearly as anything. So, why it's so important to read this, it gives us insight into how pervasive climate change literature, how persuasive this literature can be. So in other words, you might have thought that this is just something that's not very effective. It is effective, it can be effective. So it's the important thing to note here, it's easy to get angry at climate change deniers that you meet. In fact, we have a whole, one of the readings is on what if you encounter someone, I forget it's somebody's, it's like an uncle at a family dinner, like at Thanksgiving or something. And this uncle is a climate change denier. How do you talk to that person and all? It's hard because the instant, I think, you meet someone like that, you want to just get angry at them because they're spreading these myths and all. But when you realize that they're not doing this for themselves, they've been duped by the fossil fuel industry and its affiliates. I think it can make you more sympathetic to them because many of these people, maybe you have an uncle like this, they're not getting anything from it. I mean, they're not benefiting from it. I mean, yes, the fossil fuel companies are getting billions and billions of dollars, but individual deniers who have been, influenced by this literature, who've read things like this book, have been unwittingly duped to believe it, which is just not true. So it's just, I would argue, a way to be more sympathetic and also to realize, going back to that original slide, yeah, it's all about education. And I agree that it may be very difficult, maybe impossible to educate someone who has been so influenced by this literature to flipping on it. But I think that is the goal. And I think for a broad swath of people in the US who are actually in the middle, in that kind of skeptical range, aren't quite sure, education is where it's at. I believe that, but obviously, given everything I just said, so do the fossil fuel companies and their affiliates. So I would argue just something to look at when you read this, and we could go through this step by step, but I want to get to people's comments. It purports to offer a lot of evidence. So one of the things that makes this look like a real document is that it has all these footnotes and all, and it references things. And you might then think, well, this is a carefully researched document. That's the goal. And if you don't know anything about it, you may buy into that. But you need to look at these documents very carefully if you want to see. This is where critical reading and critical thinking comes in. So the introductory chapter, let's just talk about it, has 9 references, 9 footnotes at the end of endnotes at the end of the chapter. 4 of these are either published by the Heartland Institute or actually on the Heartland Institute website, so that they never actually published. And it's, of course, the very group that published the book itself. So it's hardly a credible source. So it's actually making a footnote referencing back to itself. So they'll say something like, most 97% of scientists don't. Studies have proven this. And you think, oh, well, studies have proven it. But then if you go here, you find that those studies are actually put out by this very group, either in works that they published or right on their website. So yeah, so that's nearly half of them not credible in that sense. Oh, finally. 3 of the references are to undeniably credible sources. So when you read it, you think, wait a minute, they actually reference the IPCC, they reference NASA, they reference the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. These are all super credible groups. So you might think, if NASA says it's true, it's got to be true. But then look at the actual references. The IPCC, it does appear in a footnote that it calls it out as an alarmist group. And NASA and the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences are cited because they support this idea that 97% of scientists agree the climate crisis is real. So they're credible sources, but they don't in any way back up the argument or what people are saying there. So you kind of have to, they don't help with the argument, and there's really no reason to have them as material that backs up the argument. And finally, there's an article cited, "The Myth That Climate Change is Real," is cited from the Wall Street Journal. And of course, that may seem like a credible mainstream publication, but the journal has come under fire, Wall Street Journal has come under fire, not because of the articles that it writes, but the op-ed that it publishes. And of course, Wall Street Journal is favorable to industry, and the op-eds that comes out are essentially, people have argued. In fact, I note here this article in The Guardian It says the Wall Street Journal keeps peddling big oil propaganda. And it doesn't, again, through the articles they publish, but through op-eds. And the things cited here, this is the 9th of the 9 citations in the first chapter, are in fact, from this group, which is clearly problematic. And I think this underscores the central problem here. If you actually read this stuff, you need to read it very carefully. And I think, unfortunately, we're not in the habit of, and when we get to communication, I actually have lectures on it, on how to read carefully, which you'll be watching on your own. But the main thing to do is check every source. And when I have smaller classes, I have people read things, and then I ask them, which of these references did you check? And no one ever checks them. And you just have to. It makes it really time consuming. Generally, it can just be a click or two or a few away, but you need to check before you believe any of this. You might just read this article and say, this is all, hooey. I'm not going to pay any attention to it. That's fine. But if you're beginning to be influenced, and if it's something that is referenced, you need to check that reference. So yeah, this book gives the appearance of being referenced, supported by other facts. It merely gives the appearance of doing that, as no credible sources in the first chapter, in any event, are given that actually support the claim made in the chapter, the argument of the chapter. Again, the 3 credible sources, the IPCC, NASA, and the AAAS, all simply and strongly disagree with the argument made there. So I'm curious to hear what you think about it by way of your comments, and what you think of this larger issue of disinformation targeting children. So we're jumping into the class discussion part, where I'll be reading people. There were literally hundreds of comments over the years, and even in you've already put up there, saying things like this: anger seems to be the #1 emotion elicited here. I've never been more angry reading a document. The authors of Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming are lying through their teeth for money. So here's another example. This reading, as well as the attached Amazon reviews, really pissed me off. To be honest, it really pisses me off too. As we've seen, the direct consequences of the rise of greenhouse gas emissions are more than a little frightening. Even if every person, every country on the planet agreed to quickly and decisively mitigate the climate crisis, this will still be a formidable challenge, likely the greatest challenge that humanity has ever collectively faced. However, as this book makes clear, we face another huge challenge, which is, in some sense, every bit as formidable, as the fossil fuel industry and others are working in a host of ways to attempt to keep us from acting quickly and decisively to mitigate the climate crisis. And sadly, make no mistake, they're doing a pretty damn good job. If you're unfamiliar with their methods, and I admit I was before I started researching this, I quickly realized that an enormous amount of work is being put into this literature, an enormous amount of money. Perhaps not surprisingly, as a consequence, it can be very effective at causing people to doubt the validity and severity of the climate crisis. So that's why I say, try to be sympathetic when you actually meet a denier, because it's not that they're benefiting from destroying the planet. Other people are, and other people have convinced them that this is not a good thing. So how effective is this particular book? Because the person here notes about the Amazon reviews, which I asked you to read. The first year I put this out, I forget what the Amazon reviews were, but it was 4.1 maybe, or 4.0. Then it went up to 4.4, 4.2. And now this year I just checked, the Amazon reviews give it a rating of 4.4. So it's actually been going up steadily. And that's all the more astonishing because there's some people, and I have written down here, who very much attack it. So that marginalized 0.6%, one of them says, this is the most egregious attempt to diffuse any support on the existence of global warming and climate change that I ever read. But those 4.4 rating is just labels, like I copied a couple of them down, well documented, and provides much needed balance to the climate change debate. Should be a mandatory reading for media and politicians. And that's just a couple. So if you go to Amazon, there are hundreds of reviews of this, and they all, for the most part, are effusive in recommending this book. So if you thought this book, you read it and you thought, oh, this is just hooey, who would even pay attention to it? Well, this is not the world's most perfect random sampling, but it's people who read books, and many of them. And what's interesting about this is you'll find there's a very active online community of deniers. This is once the ball got rolling. This is not the fossil fuel company itself putting these out. These are people who have their own blogs, their own podcasts, YouTube channels, whatever. They're out there spinning it out even more. And this, in a way, is part of that too, because there's some people who feel they want to help with the effort by writing a long, trying to be persuasive comment on Amazon. So don't just think that there's like this central thing, just the fossil fuel companies are doing it. It's happening to people that they've influenced are now doing it as well. It's like a snowball and now it's rolling. Yeah, really great question this person succinctly asked. I just don't quite understand what an individual will gain by pushing for a more clean and greener environment. Yeah, if you happened on this book, you might have the same question. I mean, after all, what's to be gained by pushing for a cleaner and greener environment other than, well, a cleaner and greener environment? In other words, what could possibly be the secret agenda here? After all, we hardly need one. It's obviously a worthwhile goal. So in other words, the climate change deniers say there's a secret agenda, that people pushing for climate change action have a secret agenda, and it's not this one, to have a better and cleaner environment. They've come up with a variety of conspiracy theories regarding it. One is that climate scientists are corrupt and are receiving money to sell the American public on the idea of climate change. So there's a book called The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Scientists, and on the cover, it has a hand reaching back and someone putting a wad of money into the hand. And the argument is these scientists are all corrupt because they're receiving money to do it. Now, the guy who wrote that book, his name is Tim Ball. We know where these people are getting their money. They're getting it from conservative think tanks, which is in many cases funneling money from fossil fuel affiliates. They're actually getting money to write those books, which is the irony is they're accusing, reputable scientists, some of them, on campus here, that's what they're doing. And the argument is it's coming from a range of institutions, including the federal government, as they're purportedly pursuing a goal that has nothing to do with the climate environment, which brings us to the really big conspiracy theory. So you have to follow this one because it's the central reason, the central conspiracy theory that might get people to go along with it. So when communism collapsed, in the sense of the wall going down in Europe with the former Soviet Union collapsing and then Mao's China, people were wondering what was going to be sort of the epistemological counter to the United States. And the argument here is that, and this is like the science behind it, in order to maintain a sense of self, of integrity, all sorts of entities are locked into that self as an other. For example, in a misogynistic patriarchy, the notion that the male self is consolidated as being strong, being capable, being emotional stable. How do you get that image of men being that way in a very binary way? If you have a binary like that, well, you have to have a group that is, weak, incapable, not emotionally stable, and that's the other to a man, which is a woman. In these binary structures, it's always like that. It's an incredibly nasty thing that happens because one group is consolidating their sense of self and worth by putting another person in just the opposite position. If you think about it, you can see this binary workings and dynamic all over the place, and it's really frightening. It's relevant here because the United States during the Cold War had this notion that the United States, who were we? We are, people who are free and we have rights and liberties. What's the opposite of that self, of democratic self? Well, that's in a communist country. They don't have any of those things. They're just the opposite of us. That's why we have to fight against it. But then here's the existential problem. It's really an epistemological problem. What happens when that group goes away, when Soviet Union goes away? Who's the bad guy? Who's the other? Who's the one you're going to put down? So after the Red Scare, collapsed, Unfortunately, environmentalists came on the scene as the new problem. And there was a phrase, comes around the early 90s, right after the wall went down, pretty soon after, and that is green is the new red. Or more specifically, if you've been looking in the honors section, we were just talking about this, the notion that environmentalists are best thought of like watermelons. Why watermelons? Well, they're green on the outside. Everything they say, all the, what they're doing seems to be totally green. But if you look on the inside, they're thoroughly red. This is the Red Scare again. They're communists. What's the real agenda here? Is it anything to do with the climate crisis or the environment? No. According to this conspiracy theory, it's all about communism. We are trying to, the argument is, get people to work globally to solve the climate crisis. We're arguing for bigger government, we're arguing for socialism, and that's the real agenda here. So why are these people, like the people commenting on Amazon, so adamant? Because they're trying to fight that from happening, which is often because, they're from an older generation, they still have the Red Scare in mind, and now they are fighting for it. And to this way, this conspiracy theory, it's a way of bringing big government and communism back. The fossil fuel industry, of course, has an enormous amount at stake. And just to be clear, we always hear, you've heard recently about Apple Computer being the first, $2 billion and $3 trillion, $2 billion and $3 trillion company and all that. But in terms of assets and all, the fossil fuel companies, if you look at a list of the wealthiest countries on the planet, many of them are on that list. And they're in a desperate battle to survive. So of course they're feeding these conspiracy theories out to the public, and they're trying to, it's kind of like a sleight of hand. In fact, that's what, if you've seen Merchants of Doubt, that's how the documentary opens, because, we're talking about environmentalism, we're talking about the climate crisis, but no, the conversation switches, we're talking about communism. And what we're really fighting here aren't environmentalists, because deep down inside, they're thoroughly red, they're communists. So yeah, that's sort of the brief answer to that question. What do we have to gain? That's what the conspiracy theories say. So when I first started reading the book, I hadn't read the web page introducing the book. So this is what I was talking about, or any of the Amazon reviews, or watched my introductory to it. So this is back when I did the YouTube introduction. This person says, I found myself confused and almost starting to believe, and I was reading until I took a step back and realized this book was denying climate change. I'm shocked by their convincing skills. Yeah, make no mistake, they are convincing. These are not just rants. These are people carefully and cleverly working out the best strategy to either convince or confuse as much of the public as possible. And there were literally dozens of comments like this that people who didn't realize what they had in their hands became very confused, which again is the goal, doubting and convinced. And again, that's UCSB undergrads. That's not the general public. It's nor people who would be inclined to believe something like this. So we've talked about confirmation bias already, that we tend to believe what we already believe, in the sense that if we're already skeptical of the climate crisis and we read something like this, it convinces us even more. It reinforces a belief that we already have. Presumably, this person and other folks weren't of that population that thought the climate crisis is real. So it wasn't a confirmation bias at work. It was just the pure effectiveness of the rhetoric here, and it is really effective. So I went to high school in a relatively conservative town. My freshman year of high school, I remember the honors biology teacher explaining how climate change was a hoax, only perpetuated to continue taxing Americans. Again, big government, socialism. I took this to be true. Why not? Your honors biology teacher said it was true. At that point, I was 13 years old and wasn't presented with any other information would contradict his argument. It wasn't until my junior year of high school that I began to question what that teacher's motives were for spreading disinformation to 13 and 14-year-olds. I then realized how many of my classmates were not going to have the same realization as I did about climate change. Many of my classmates, most likely, still to this day, believe that climate change is a hoax because of this teacher, and will see it only as a ploy to use to tax Americans. Yeah, so again, you wouldn't think a place like California, a pretty progressive state, our laws are all sort of geared toward climate action. But yeah, it happens here. It happens all over the place. And there, by the way, this was the one I decided to give you, but there were many more like it. And of course, it buys into that conspiracy theory about big government through taxes. And that's one of the, again, simplest ways of attacking this. Even if you don't buy into the conspiracy theory, just use that word. It's not a 4-letter word, but it's like one. It's a 3-letter word, tax. If you think that, any action here is going to cost you money, many people will just full stop, turn against it, not vote for anything like it because they think that's it. And apparently that's what this teacher thought. But just regarding that, it should be noted that there are countries in the world built on the model here, not of communism, but of democratic socialism. They're democracies. In fact, people vote there and are more active politically by far than people in the United States, but they have a stronger central government, stronger than the corporations that are influencing it. So it's illegal for big corporations to try to influence the government. And yeah, they pay more money in taxes. So what I'm thinking here are places like France or Denmark or even Germany. They pay more taxes, but you get a lot back in return. So what do I mean by that? Free healthcare, free dental care for everybody, free college education for everyone, now including graduate school. So all of you are massing debt to pay for this, or your parents are. It's all free in those countries. There's a higher minimum wage, there are protections for workers. So instead of a 40-hour week there, you have a 30-hour week in places like Denmark, free mass transit, better mass transit. So yeah, I mean, it is the case. It's not a lie here in the sense that it would be more taxes, but on the other hand, you would get back essential things that we should have in this country, I would argue, things like comprehensive health care. Yeah, but it is really disturbing. And actually, there's a similar comment. Let me just get to the next one. It's frustrating that deniers target teachers, legislators, and business people, but quite frankly, who else do we think they would target? They want to get at the root of our society, children who trust their teachers more than anyone. As I was reading, I was reminded of all my teachers growing up. None of them talked about climate change at all. It's another similar comment from another person. Most of what I myself learned about the climate crisis is through this class in last quarter's English 22. Well, that's good to hear. So it's interesting. This is not addressing people spreading disinformation like the last person was saying, the teacher flat out denied it. This is saying it's just not taught. And in a way, it's not as bad, but it's still a huge problem because we don't want students to be taught the wrong thing, but we want them to be taught something, the right thing, and that's not happening. And the problem here in California is California does not mandate the teaching of the climate crisis, climate science in general. And I'm talking about K through 12, but also we can talk about it on university level. So under California's Public Resource Code, which was amended in 2018, and I'm quoting from that, schools are encouraged to teach climate literacy, which by definition includes climate change, but the code does not mandate that schools teach it, however. So encouraging is not mandating the teaching of it. And there was an informal poll, and this was done the year after that in the Oakland Unified School District, and it was found that, and this is in Oakland, California, about 60% of surveyed science teachers were not familiar with the state's environmental principles and concepts, and nearly 70% were unfamiliar with that change. So it's a problem because not only is the law just encouraging and not requiring it, roughly 2 out of 3 of teachers aren't even aware of what the law is. So, even if you were to enact stronger laws, teachers may not be aware of it. But the really interesting thing, I think, is that the good news is that in more than 40 California districts and counties, they started something called Schools for Climate Action. And this is a program designed to get climate education into schools. The fascinating thing, I don't know whether it's good or bad, depressing or encouraging, is that this is not a federal action, it's not a state action, it's not a county action. It was all led by a middle school teacher who created this group because he was frustrated that action wasn't happening, and he built a program around it and all. So that's encouraging, I guess, that we have action trying to happen, but the fact that it's not being mandated by the state or the federal government is disturbing. After reading the book, the start of this book, I am in shock. This highlights a deep flaw that we face in our time, which is Google and the ability to find anything. This leads to a problem called confirmation bias, which we've talked about, which is a term used in psychology referring to the act of only acknowledging opinions and facts that are aligned with your prior beliefs. If someone was in denial or only concerned with their day-to-day problems and didn't want to deal with the reality of climate change, they would seek out this book to confirm that's denial. Yeah, I think that's right. The problem is, mentioned invoking Google and search engines here, it's an even bigger issue than that. So if you got 10, so you put in a search term like climate crisis, and if you got 10 things, you would only pick those based on confirmation bias that align with your beliefs. But as you know, that's not how the algorithms work for Google or any other modern search engine like Bing and all, that you are going to present it with material that already is more biased to it. So as you know, these groups like search engines, they collect thousands of data points on you individually. They can tell what search history is like for a range of people, and then you will be more likely to be presented with that kind of material. And that may mean that you don't even realize this is a problem. And the reason I say that is, for you, maybe you've only, they know your demographic and all, but you've only clicked on things that believe that said that the climate crisis is real and about action on it and all. And you might think, well, Google seems to be pretty unbiased because they just give real answers. But that's you. Someone else who is a denier is going to automatically get denial text fed to them more often, regardless of confirmation bias, because it's already being done by the algorithm itself. And I'm not saying that Google is intentionally doing this or that any other search engine. That's in a general way how their algorithms work. So that is going to kind of stack the deck against you with any kind of issue like this. And it's exacerbating the problem, because if you are inclined to sort of lean toward denial, between confirmation bias and these algorithms, you're gonna start sloping very quickly into it. So let's take an iClicker poll. If I can get over here. You may have not have read it. If not, click E. But I'm curious, the people who have read it, did you find it useful and engaging? Kind of useful, maybe not so much. Generally, it was not altogether useful, but had a few interesting points. We have 5 minutes to go, folks. So it's disrespectful to everyone in the room to get up and walk out, because everybody else is trying to pay attention here. If I have to, I will put these at the very beginning and very end of the lectures. Okay, so let's see what people said. Most people didn't read it, and kind of useful, not that useful. Okay. It's good for me to know these things, by the way, because it will impact what I keep going in future years. So let's jump to the next slide, which is to add on to the list of hypercritical things that climate change deniers have done. I'm sitting here thinking about what I said regarding the billboard of Unabomber saying, "I still believe in climate change." Do you? Do climate change deniers, what could we put on a billboard? I keep thinking of different prominent climate change deniers, but in the end, I think the most effective billboard would be just a barrel of oil that read, I don't believe in climate change, but I also don't have family in Miami. So you remember from the, the fair weather daytime flooding of Miami that it's a real issue there. So first, I'd really like to see that billboard. The one thing, and we can end on this, that fossil fuel interests are very effective at what they do. So in other words, they can do the campaign, they can have the Unabomber, they can plaster it on billboards because they're well financed and all. But the sad thing is not the case that there's any funding anywhere to put this on a billboard. There should be. And you can imagine laws that would make it. So if you remember, you may not, well, you wouldn't remember, but in the 1990s, when cigarettes were attacked, the cigarette industry had to pay taxes that resulted in that tax money went to advertising to try to get people to stop. There were billboards saying, don't buy cigarettes. There are no billboards now for the climate change activism, because who's going to be funding it? The cigarette thing was so effective because they were able to get the cigarette industry itself to fund it, which was clever and something. Wouldn't it be great if we could do that? Okay, so that's it for today.